Thanks for tuning in. You're listening to the Embrace Mental Health podcast,
where we embrace a not-so-clinical approach
to conversations surrounding all things mental health. Hello and happy Mental Health Monday, everybody. Welcome to the Embrace Mental Health podcast. I'm your host, Kelsey, and today I've got my co-host, Wesley, with me. Hi, Wesley.
Hello, good to be with you.
And this is episode 7. We're really just keep adding on episodes here. I don't know.
Lucky number 7, one at a time.
The lucky episode, yeah. I suppose, years from now we'll be like, oh, we thought 7 was a big number, sure, but...
Right.
But yeah, I don't know.
Hopefully.
It's kind of exciting. But So today our topic is grief, which obviously we've got Thanksgiving coming up, and on top of that, other holiday season, and that can be a difficult season for grief. But before we get to all of that, I have our intro question here. So our introductory question for today is, what is your favorite family holiday tradition? Can be Thanksgiving, Christmas, whatever it is. Wesley, do you have something in mind?
I do. Yeah. I was thinking through, and of course there are several that came to mind, but I would say my all-time favorite would be getting together with my cousins and their family. And we usually would do it in January, kind of a delayed
Yep.
Christmas gathering, just so that we could make sure we have time for it. And staying the night there. And so we'd get there the night before. And of course, I'm thinking back to being a kid and a teenager. And we'd always stay up way too late playing GameCube and eating junk food and drinking eggnog and all this stuff. And then I think back especially to being a teenager and sleeping until like 10 or 11 a.m. and being like the last one or one of the last ones up. And even that, even though it felt kind of crappy sleeping on like, the old spare bedroom mattress, it was kind of a nice, comfortable feeling waking up so late and having this delicious breakfast and sharing presents and everything with everyone. So I would say, yeah, those extended family gatherings are my all-time favorite.
Nice, yeah. How many cousins do you have?
Well, I think especially, and you actually know Mark and Luke,
Yeah.
it's their family on my dad's side. And so
Okay.
they're really the only first cousins who I'm close with. And I'm not as close with the cousins on my mom's side because they're way older than me. They're like just about old enough to be my parents. And also they lived out of state for most of my life, maybe even my whole life. Well, some of them lived in state, but even less close to those. So anyway, family dynamics, but
Yeah.
2 cousins who I'm really close with. So it's a relatively small extended family if you look at it that way.
Yeah.
But we were
Yeah.
close, so that's the important thing.
Yeah. It's funny you say that because honestly, no offense to any of my family that's listening to this, but like the extended family Christmas gatherings are like almost slightly traumatic for me.
Yeah, I'm sure you're not alone there. Yeah.
Yeah, true. Like I think I've mentioned on other episodes, like I'm the youngest in my family, and basically everybody else was adults by the time I was a kid, and so I was kind of like the lone kid amongst, I don't know. Most of my cousins when I was younger, I feel like were like in college or just in that like post-grad kind of era of their lives. And one of the funniest traditions, every single Christmas at my grandma's house, they would have these marshmallow fights. And it's like now I think I would really enjoy it. But because I was a little kid, I think I got hit not just once, but like twice, got black eyes from getting
Oh my gosh.
pelted
Those are
with
some stale marshmallows.
Yeah. And I felt like as soon as I was old enough to enjoy it and not just get hurt by it, then they stopped doing it. But
Right.
that's not
It
my
would help.
favorite tradition, but I was just thinking, but
It
yeah.
would help if they didn't reuse the same marshmallows every year. It'd probably get a little
Yeah.
softer. Yeah.
Yeah, they get to be like snowballs after a while, but but I guess my favorite holiday is Thanksgiving. I like Christmas too, sometimes more than other years. But Thanksgiving to me is like Christmas, but without all the pressure on it. And I suppose that's because I'm one of the lucky ones who doesn't have to spend all day cooking. I usually get just a couple of sides or so, and so I don't feel as much pressure. But, I just love hanging out with my family and eating really good food, and we're all sports junkies, and so we love watching football all day and watching the Lions lose. Although this year, I have hope.
We have
Good
hope.
hope.
We
Yes,
have
high
reason
hope.
to have hope.
Yes, it's unbelievable. But yeah, I've just always really enjoyed spending Thanksgiving just like kind of a low key day doing all the things that we love together. So
Yeah.
yeah,
Nice. Yeah,
nothing
it's funny that
specific, but yeah.
neither of us picked like Christmas Eve or Christmas. And
Yeah, yeah.
again, I think a lot of people, it's like there's so much hype built around it. I saw this random article for whatever reason. I remember this part of it is like ranking the holidays, and they put Christmas Eve at the top, and Christmas was like somewhere in the middle. And I was thinking,
Interesting.
what in the world? But then I realized it is like so many things. The anticipation of it is ends up being even better than the thing itself, even though
Yeah,
I have good experiences with Christmas Day. So
yeah,
for the most
yeah,
part.
that's true.
Mhm. All
All
right.
right. Well, that brings us to our actual topic, and we have our resident hot. What? Maybe you should just tell us exactly what you've done. I know
Resident
you've.
Hot what? No.
I was gonna say. I started to say resident hospice, but I
Oh yeah.
couldn't figure out
Yeah.
what your actual topic was, but
Yeah. Well,
or
I
title.
actually, it's interesting that we're recording today, and of course we record ahead of time, and so it's actually close to Halloween right at this moment. But yeah, I actually just earlier today had my annual meeting with all of my fellow grief support services managers with Hospice of Michigan from across the state. And so we got to share stories and talk about where that department is headed without me since a week and a half from today is my last day there, actually. But anyway, I've been with a large not-for-profit hospice called Hospice of Michigan. And if anyone out there is interested in a hospice, first of all, I'm sorry for your situation, but Hospice of Michigan is all over the Lower Peninsula, and I couldn't recommend them highly enough, even though I'm leaving there. But anyway, yeah, I have been a grief support services manager. I just tell people a grief counselor because people instantly know what that is with them for just about 5 years. If I were sticking around 2 weeks longer, it would be almost exactly 5 years
Oh my
that I
goodness.
was there. And before that, I was actually interning with Hospice of Michigan, and I've gotten all kinds of education specifically on grief. And so, if there's one thing that I am an expert in, it's probably grief and mental health. So, definitely happy to be able to join you today.
Great. Yes.
Yeah. So, yeah, I'll probably be doing a little bit more talking, maybe a little bit more lopsided, I would guess, just because I could probably do like a 3 hour podcast on grief, which I will not do today. But there's just a lot to be said because I find it, even though it's one of the hardest things that any of us ever goes through, it's also from a kind of clinical standpoint, I find it to be endlessly interesting and meaningful and powerful of a topic to really reflect on. So I enjoy talking about it. So, first of all, I will start where there's a couple of kind of grief experts, like, really big time, I guess, if anyone can be a grief expert, who have had an impact on me. And our department at Hospice of Michigan lean a lot on the teachings of the author and speaker Alan Wolfelt. So, if anyone out there is looking for a good book or any other kind of material literature to look at, I would recommend Wolfelt's stuff, as well as David Kessler. I would say they're the two biggest names these days that I'm aware of. I'm sure there are some other excellent ones too. But anyway, oh, and then uh, what is her name? Megan Devine is another one I've really loved recently, and she has a lot of good YouTube videos, interviews, and stuff. So there's some recommendations right off the bat. But Alan Wolfelt, I've heard him speak a couple of times when he comes into town, and he starts with this, and I think it's a great place to start, that we live in a death-denying culture. I think that's important to keep in mind. And this is what first turned me on to being a grief counselor. When I was doing my undergrad in psychology, I took a class called Death, Grief, and Loss, and it just happened to fit into my schedule. It was an elective in my program, and I was surprised how fascinated I was by it. And the thing that really caught my attention was the idea that it's a universal experience. Of course, we're all going to die. I like to say we all have an expiration date. That's an easy way to put it.
Death,
And
taxes, and
that's right. Yeah, the
yeah.
only inevitabilities, the only universal things that we experience, and we all, I would say, since we all have some kind of connection, even those who are lonely and isolated, at some point in their life have some significant connection. So we all experience grief, and it's, I would say, one of the few remaining taboos in our culture for most people. Most people are very uncomfortable talking about death and grief and end of life and what that entails. And you think about how much money we spend on trying to, the billionaires, what are they trying to do? They're trying to build shelters in case of an apocalypse, and they're trying to invest in drugs that will help them live forever. So that speaks to, I think, the human condition, and how much money we all spend trying to look younger and live forever, and all the medication commercials on TV. And so, yeah, I think that that's important to recognize, that if you are listening to this and maybe you're getting a little uncomfortable, or you're thinking, this is kind of a strange topic, it's not something that I hear about in my day-to-day life, well, you're not alone. That's the way that we are. So, but I think it's helpful to define what grief even is. And grief is the normal, natural reaction to loss. And it's important to recognize also that all change in life involves loss. I have something on my website, I think, or maybe I took it down, I don't remember, but it used to say that the only constant in life is change, and all change involves loss. And
Yeah.
all loss needs to be grieved. And so from that perspective, grief, even though it's something that makes some of us uncomfortable, it's also a constant in our lives that we ignore.
Yeah. I think it's interesting too because even good change includes loss. Because
Absolutely.
even, I think of in the past year, I've switched jobs and some of those things. And while they were a better fit for me, there were still losses that I needed to grieve. And yeah, even good change includes loss. And so, yeah.
Exactly. Yeah, the kinds of things you look forward to and celebrate. Well, yeah, I mentioned my Hospice of Michigan meeting today, and I was given hugs and had tears in my eyes. So, yeah, or you think about a graduation or
Yeah.
a wedding or moving, sometimes things that we work toward and we celebrate, but it means that there is some loss. Things are not going to be the way that they've always been.
Hmm.
Even think about getting out of a toxic relationship. That is something that is difficult in some ways, but that overall it's like, oh, good, I know this was the best thing for me, and this is going to be the start of a new chapter in my life. And yet that's what we were used to.
Hmm.
I work with people who are a lot of people who are caregivers of their loved ones who are dying, and surprisingly to them, and the only reason it's not surprising to me is because I see it all the time, but one of the things that they have the hardest time with sometimes is the loss of that caregiver role, even though anyone who's been there knows that it's extremely demanding
Hmm.
and taxing and isolating oftentimes, but even that you miss it. So that's what you
Interesting.
get used to. Yeah. So some common symptoms of grief, obviously sadness, we all know that one. Guilt and anger are really common reactions to loss. Difficulty focusing and remembering, trouble sleeping. Sometimes people sleep more, oftentimes they have trouble sleeping, and change in appetite. Loss of motivation is a big one. The things that used to interest you may no longer interest you. And if anybody who has depression is listening to this, you might think, hey, that sounds like depression. And actually, the symptoms are very similar. In fact, I've had to take classes on how to delineate between grief and depression. And really, the easiest thing is, if I have a client who isn't sure if they're grieving or if they're depressed, I would ask, well, when did this depression set in? And if it set in since the loss, that's an easy litmus test. And usually that is the answer. But yeah, very similar kinds of symptoms. And people often will try to take antidepressants because they're grieving, because it does help, quote, I'm doing quotation air quotes there. It does help some of those symptoms. But the thing is that I always encourage people to be very cautious about medicating your grief. I think for some people in some rare situations, I would say, yeah, you really need this as a temporary measure to kind of get your feet on the ground. But for most people, and this is something I'm sure I'll return to throughout this podcast, but the only way out of grief is to go through it. The only way to get to a place where it's not a big problem for you is to familiarize yourself with your pain and to feel your feelings, express them, talk about it, get support. There are no shortcuts here. If you try to take shortcuts, you're just going to keep carrying around your grief, and it'll have a negative impact on your life. So that's
Yeah.
another thing that I find interesting about it, I guess, is just that it's so unavoidable. It's something that no matter how rich you are, how much prestige you have, it can level us.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, that's true.
So the next thing, and this is another Wolfelt idea, I think, and I'm sure he wasn't the first one to have it, but he's the one who popularized it that I know, is the difference between grief and mourning. A lot of people use those words interchangeably, and I think in some cases they could be. I'm not here to police anyone's language, but it helps from my perspective to think about the difference. And for those who are in the middle of it, it might help too. Like I said, grief is what we feel naturally. If you go through a significant loss to a person or a situation or a pet or anything like this that you had any kind of attachment to, you are grieving, even if you don't realize it, even if you don't show it. It's something that you feel and that you experience and that affects your life, period. But mourning is the outward expression of that grief, and it typically involves bringing in other people.
Hmm.
So a funeral is a mourning ritual. A grief support group is mourning. Obviously, crying is mourning, expressing your feelings, journaling. These are outward acts. And again, they usually involve bringing in others of your grief. So everyone grieves and not everyone mourns. And that can help to separate the two sometimes
Hmm.
to help people understand their situation.
Mm-hmm. I think it's interesting that you talk about feeling your feelings because, I feel like that's not just a thing that's true of grieving, but that's probably a definite, obvious place where in some ways our feelings are allowed. Like people are a little bit more understanding of grief, although I'm sure we'll get into some of that too. But I remember, in times of my life where I have been grieving, where I could see how it is easy to want to medicate it or to just not feel it because grief is just such an overwhelming experience.
Absolutely.
And like you said, it's one of those things that you just have to go through. And so a lot of times we just want to avoid things that are overwhelming. But like you've said, you can spend years of your life avoiding it, but really it's still there. And at some point it needs to be grieved in order for it to be,
Mm-hmm.
yeah, I don't know.
Exactly. I've talked to people whose losses were 3, 4, 5 years ago, sometimes like 15 years ago. And when you bring it up and they push it down and they well up instantly, they kind of choke on their feelings. I mean, they act like a healthy grieving person would act like 3 or 4 weeks after their loss.
Yeah.
That grief waits for you. You can postpone it, but it will wait for you. And that's where one of the common things people hear is you got to stay busy after you have a loss. That's a common piece of advice that is not good advice. It can help to have things in your life that are engaging. You don't want to just kind of isolate and just kind of, you don't want to feel your feelings 24/7. You can't be in
Yeah.
that deep dark place all the time. There's
Yeah.
a medium. You need some of each. And but those who are busy, busy, busy to avoid their grief, all they're doing is postponing it. So, yeah. And actually, this conversation, this part of it reminds me of a conversation that I had with a woman not too long ago on the phone. And I doubt she's listening to this podcast. And I won't give any other identifying information. But I called her because a big part of my hospice job has been calling people who lose patients on our hospice services. I follow up with them for 13 months, or at least I'm available to do that. And so it almost always starts with a phone call, about 2 or 3 weeks after the loss, usually. And I was talking with this woman, and she was saying that, yeah, she right away saying that, she's doing well because she had this idea that grief came in stages, and a lot of people think this that there's what is it, denial and anger and bargaining, and there's I could talk a long time about that, but long story short, that's not how it works. And it's not a checklist, and it's not sequential stages. And even Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, who came up with those stages, those were stages of dying, and people would apply them to grief. And anyway, she did not see it the way that a lot of people see it, even though she's the one who originated it. But anyway, but she was saying, yeah, I think that I'm through the denial and the anger, and now I'm just kind of numb, and I'm taking medication, and that's helping a lot. And I'm really worried about my child kid was maybe 11, 12, 13. And, because he's asking all these questions and having a hard time, wants to talk about the person who died. And so he's really the one who's the concern, and then I'm thinking like, oh no, like everything you're saying is upside down, and where do I even start? Yeah, but of course she's far from alone. That's not to pick on her. I think that
Yeah.
probably everybody has encountered someone who thinks that way. That it's like
Yeah.
the more you're feeling it, the worse you are. We go to funerals, and you think of somebody at a funeral who's just sobbing the whole time, who is really close with the one who died, maybe a spouse or something like that, and it's like, oh no, she's really having a hard time. She's going to struggle. And then there's another family member who's completely stoic, straight face, maybe smiling and shaking hands. But any grief counselor out there is going to be more worried about that one than about the one who can actually
Yeah.
express and feel those feelings.
Yeah.
So it's a
Yeah.
different way of looking at it. And I think that's where I could go on and on about it, because grief has so many lessons for life that oftentimes the way that we try to go through life in ways that are convenient and painless are actually not what's best for us.
Yeah.
So my next point that I wanted to talk about was kind of busting another myth about grief, and that is that time heals all wounds. It's another thing that people often hear. It's a cliche, and many cliches are good cliches. They're there for a reason, but this one is not. Time is one important ingredient. You can know all there is to know about grief and mental health and all kind, anything. You can have all the tools possible, great therapist, support group, really interesting life, but it's still going to take time. It's going to take, it all depends on how attached you are to the one who died. And so in some cases, it might be weeks, in some cases, months, and in some cases, years, no matter how, I guess, effectively you're grieving, how healthy you're going through it. So time is an important ingredient, but like I said earlier, it depends on what you do with the time. If you're just avoiding the whole time, then you're not really going to make any progress at all. So that's something that's important to think about.
Yeah. Interesting.
So, and I guess that leads to another point here about the importance of expressing feelings. And this is something that some of us are more comfortable with than others. There's this idea that there's different ways of grieving, and there certainly are. There's different ways of expressing feelings. Some people might be less apt to talk about their feelings or to have intense emotional expression. They might express through creative ways. They might express through writing or building something or spending time with a beloved animal or something like that. There's all different kinds of ways to feel and express your feelings, but you need to do that. And so if that's something that you are uncomfortable doing, understand that when you're grieving, you really have to practice it. And even if you're just alone in your bedroom at night crying, that's really better than not crying at all. And so that's fine. When I hear people saying, yeah, I'm not really comfortable crying around you or other people, but I do at home, it's like, that's fine, as long as you're letting it out, because it can kind of, you think of it like a drain that gets clogged up, really. And if you've ever run into somebody who needs to grieve and has not done so, it's very obvious. They just really shut down all of their feelings.
Yeah. Yeah. Which is interesting because this is almost like I wasn't planning this when I scheduled this, but I think it's our next episode or maybe within the next couple of weeks, but the topic is dealing with feelings. And there's already so much that you're talking about that I know we'll cover in other basics too, but that's kind of interesting how, it makes sense, but yeah.
Yeah, and the whole gamut of feelings can come through grief, not just sadness. Like I said, anger and guilt are common ones, but also, you could be angry at the person who died, or angry at God or the universe or whoever's in charge around here, or you could be feeling betrayed. You could be feeling abandoned. You can be. One thing about anger that I'll point out is that, and I'm sure we'll get into this next week too, but it happens with grief a lot. The anger can be a masking emotion. And so if somebody is feeling angry after a loss, I always encourage them. Sometimes anger is just straight up anger, and that's legitimate, of course. But I've seen this picture of an iceberg, and the 10% is on the surface. That's the anger. The 90% is under the water. And so you can ask yourself, what else might be there? usually my first suspect is pain. A lot of times when somebody's feeling angry, they're
Yeah.
really masking pain. And where that comes from is anger is really the only major emotion that doesn't make us feel so vulnerable.
Yep.
And so a lot of times we're trained that, and especially I think traditionally men are trained that like anger is the only acceptable emotion, and
Yeah.
happiness to some degree, but don't get too gleeful, you know. And so, but and so we reach for anger because it's the most comfortable one.
Yeah.
But sometimes there can be all kinds of things behind it.
Yeah. I
So,
think too, it can be not just anger at the person who died or, whatever
oh
the
no,
loss looks like, but a lot of times it can be anger at yourself or I
yes,
should have, which I guess I should have often falls into that grief category too. But again, if you're not comfortable feeling guilty, then it might mask as anger towards yourself. That
anger
can
turned
be,
inward, exactly.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah, yeah, the would have, should have, could have's. And
yeah,
you know what? We're just labeling these human experiences, and so sometimes it's impossible to draw the lines.
yeah.
So, yeah, sometimes relief that the person has died, especially if you were a caregiver, you might be feeling relief on their behalf that they're no longer in pain, and relief for yourself that hey, now you have all kinds of free time, and that doesn't take away from how much you love that person. That's just the
Yeah.
reality.
I think even sometimes that difficult space where you have a relief because the relationship had some strain to it, but that just
Yes. Oh
because
yeah.
there's strain to it doesn't mean that there's not also grief that's a part of it or even
Yeah.
mourning that can be,
Hmm.
like you said, all kinds of emotions coming up at the same time, which is why it's
Yeah.
can be so overwhelming because it's
So
all
hard
the
to.
emotions at once, some kind of.
Yeah, yeah, a glass case of emotion.
Yes. I
It can be
can't
difficult to
believe it
parse
took
out.
us 7 episodes to reference Anchorman, Wes.
Well, I wasn't in all of them. You have to keep that in mind. So,
That's true. That's true.
yeah. So anyway, yeah, and you make a very good point. And sometimes the emotions can be conflicting. It's like, how could I
Mm-hmm.
possibly be feeling relief and guilt and missing this person and angry at them, or oftentimes angry at a medical professional? There's all kinds of things that can come up, um, and the answer is yes. You can hold all of those things.
Yeah.
Uh, just to share something personal, since I know that you and Autumn usually share more kind of from your personal stories than I do, but this is a significant part of my life where, as I was an intern at this hospice, my supervisor, who was going to be retiring soon, she kind of groomed me to take her spot. Um, my grandfather had dementia due to Alzheimer's or cognitive decline, it's called now, but it's dementia, same thing. And he spent his last few weeks in a care facility, and we knew that he didn't have very long. And my mom had texted me and said that my grandpa, his like he's just kind of more out of it. He's really kind of slowing down. He's not eating so much, and I'm seeing that. And my mom, who is, you know, she's not a grief professional, and she's has mixed feelings about her dad dying. Of course, she knows that he's having a hard time, and so I'm sure, when there's Alzheimer's, anybody who's lost a loved one to Alzheimer's can tell you that there's usually some relief there on their behalf because so much of their brain changes. You don't experience them as the same person.
Mm-hmm.
And anyway, so uh, I told this to my supervisor. I was in the office there with her doing my internship work, and I was saying, Nancy, I'm seeing everything that my mom is saying. This is the stuff that we tell our hospice families to look out for, that they only have days, if not hours, left. And so she said, you should go. She said, and I'm getting a little emotional because it's just so meaningful and significant to me, and such a beautiful thing for her to do, such a gift. She said that you should go because worst case scenario, you get to spend some time with your grandpa, and if he does die before you see him again, you'll be glad that you went. And so I did. I left right then, and when I got there to the nursing home, or it wasn't a nursing home, I forget exactly what kind of facility it was, but anyway, it might have been, it doesn't matter. I got there and spent some time there with him and my mom for a little while. And I think maybe one of my sisters was there. I don't recall exactly everyone who was there. And my wife, Marissa, met me there, and she was pregnant with our son. And I hadn't had a chance to share that good news with my grandpa yet. And we had just found out she's pregnant a few weeks earlier or something, or maybe 2 weeks, and we hadn't seen him. So anyway, got to see him, and we actually were the last ones, other than the people who took care of him, we were the last ones to see him before he died. And so I'm so glad that we went, got to share with him that my wife was pregnant, and his eyes kind of lit up for a little while, and he said, wow. And so, whether or not he was actually processing that, I believe he was, and it
Yeah.
helps me to believe he was. So, yeah. And then afterward, I texted Nancy and just said, thank you so much. And she said, take your time and feel your feelings. So that always stuck with me.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, and by the way, when I meet with people before their loved one has died and they're already starting that grief journey because of the way they're changing, or they're just anticipating that loss, I will encourage them to really make the most of the time that they have. That's the important thing. I'll give some education, but I'll say, you know what? You're gonna go through this one way or another. And so here's some things you can expect. Here's some support that you have available to you. But right now, really focus on being with this person.
Yeah. Yeah.
So another point I wanted to make was that a lot of people find helpful is that really all throughout life, but especially when you're grieving, it's stark that there can be a separation between your head and your heart. There can be a separation between what you know kind of on an intellectual level to be true and what you're actually feeling and experiencing.
Mm-hmm.
So I see this most commonly, I would say, in the initial days and weeks when somebody says, I keep picking up my phone to call this person, and then I remember that they're not there.
Mm-hmm.
Or it just doesn't feel normal. It feels like, he'll be walking through the door any second. These kinds of things. And it's like we're having a conversation with a grief counselor about how this person has died. So they know that they've died. They're not pretending otherwise. And yet that feeling that they should still be there, is still present.
Mm-hmm.
And this goes for all of grief. And I would argue all of life, even though we like in our society, I would say most of us like to live in the head and logical thinking and, kind of post-enlightenment. But there are other ways of experiencing life and of knowing things, intuition. And grief really lives there. So that's important to recognize that sometimes what you know and what you feel can be very conflicting, and that doesn't make your thinking or your feeling any less legitimate or important.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's an interesting point because I think, I don't know, I, for one, am a big old feeler. So like, I mean, not to say that I'm not logical, because I do hate when people try to pretend like you're either logical or you have a lot of feelings, and those are not dichotomies, those are false dichotomies. But I think there's a piece of which, a lot of times some people want to stay in the logical because that feels like a safer place to be. Mm-hmm. But I do think sometimes grief can be that first place where that your emotions, they'll find you whether you're ready for it or not, so it's an interesting piece of, you can try to logically understand grief, but at the same time, loss is something that has a unique way of affecting even the greatest Mr. Spocks of us all.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. I can hear his voice saying that grief is not rational, and so I don't feel grief or something like that. But so it's not a puzzle that you can put together. It simply doesn't work that way.
Yeah.
So thinking about it in that way is not as helpful as things like poetry speak very much to grief. Art, painting, music, certainly. Anything that you do with your hands, of course, writing, like I said, being with a pet, these kinds of tactile, experiential, abstract kinds of things can be very, very healing. Being outside, and it's like it's not and maybe this is why I know that we talked in an earlier episode about how I don't see mental health as a like an illness and a prescription kind of model.
Yeah.
And I think it's because so much of my concept of mental health is rooted in grief work, because it's simply not that. You can't say, okay, just kind of plug in these things and then you'll be all better.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
maybe the most vivid example of that in mental health.
Yeah.
Okay. Another point I wanted to talk about that folks find helpful sometimes is to think about how you have your primary loss of the person who died, or the loss of your job or your home or whatever it is, your pet. But then you have all kinds of secondary losses, like ripples coming out from where you throw a stone. And so what that means is that because of this change, all kinds of other things are different. So let's say that I have the loss of a parent, which I'll have to cross that bridge someday, hopefully not anytime soon. I'm lucky to have both my parents here, but when that happens, that's going to change our family dynamics. Whichever of my parent passes, they contributed something to the family, and we'll either have to do without those roles, or someone will have to fill them, or something else. And that will affect my other parent who is still living. That will affect the way that they relate to me and my household. That will affect probably how I'm spending my time. That will affect all kinds of, and you could go on and on about just kind of these theoretical ideas. And until you actually go through it, you really can't appreciate, and I include myself in this, I can't appreciate how much of an impact it has. And I would say this is the most true if it's somebody who you live with or someone who you see with every single day. It affects everything. Your life is completely upside down. And so you really, grief the significance of that kind of a loss cannot be overstated. And unfortunately, the tendency in our society is to minimize that grief and loss. Like, okay, you get 3 weeks and then it's back to work, or
Right.
even people, and you're lucky if you have people who give you a year, but even people saying, okay, you got past the year anniversary, time to kind of turn the page. But that's not how it works either. You never stop grieving. Your grief doesn't go away. The load can get lighter if you do the work over time. But as long as you love and remember that person, you're going to miss them. And again, that's not necessarily a bad thing, because that means that you still have that tie to them. You can't possibly, you either have to have the tie and be grieving, or you have to completely forget about that person. And I think that most people would choose the first option.
Yeah. I don't know if this reference will make you roll your eyes or make you geek out, but it just kind of reminds me of that quote, the ever quoted quote from the WandaVision series of,
oh yeah,
what is grief if not love persevering?
Yeah.
And I think
I like that quote a lot.
Yeah. I think it's not even so much like your love for that person persevering, but in some ways their love persevering for you too. Of like, I remember my grandma passed away unexpectedly when I was in college, and she lived a mile and a half from campus. And so I remember she died like a week before we were supposed to go back to school. And so when I went back to school, like just everything, all the little things that reminded me of her, like the pillow she had sewed for me, the car I drove was a gift from her, and driving past her street, driving past her church, just all those little things that always reminded me of her. But while it was difficult at the same time, like, there was a love persevering there, where not only my love for her was persevering, but her love for me was persevering through those things too. So, yeah.
Yeah, that's beautiful, right? Yeah, here's something that I just find so beautiful, that, and it goes along with what you're saying, that, my quote that for whatever reason always makes me choke up about that is, and as you can tell, I'm a feelings person too, even though I tend to come across, I can be quite analytical too, but it's from Harry Potter, when Sirius Black says to Harry, and then just the delivery is so good. It always gets me. It's the ones who love us never really leave us.
Yeah.
And that's true. And even those who don't believe in some kind of afterlife, like we'll be reunited with our loved ones. I think that if you think about what made them them, if I ask you about your person who died, what made them them, you wouldn't talk very much about their physical presence or what they looked like. You would talk about stories of experiences that you've had. You would talk about their personality, you talk about the difference they've made in your life and in the world. So, and they're both choking up because we can all relate to this, and that's okay. And I always keep a box of tissues on my desk because it's just kind of like a kind of a side effect of this work. And
Yeah.
I'm a human being, and that's a good thing. So, yeah, you think about these things, and those things are as present as they've ever been. And so, not to, I'm the last person any of my clients would tell you, I'm the last person to say, hey, look at the silver lining, look at the bright side, let's spin
Yeah.
this in a positive way. We need to go to those difficult places. But um, I firmly believe that um, the people who die are still very much in a very real way present with us in these ways. And that makes us think about our own lives. This is one of the great gifts of being a grief counselor, is thinking about the fact that it's all limited, that my mortality is always staring me in the face.
Yeah.
And thinking about, I don't know, none of us is guaranteed tomorrow, and that includes my dearest loved ones.
Mhm.
And so it helps me make the most of my time with them. And it helps me think about the impact that I have in the world around me, and my adjacent world. It's like, if I can make a difference in my world, then that will affect the people around me, and that will affect the people around them. And so that is kind of a form of living forever, even for those who are not at
Yeah.
all, who don't think that that's a real thing. It's a very real thing, and I'm not pretending like I'm immortal, and yet the most important parts of me will live on long after I'm gone.
Yeah.
So, and we're not even done.
I was gonna
All
say,
right.
anybody who makes it through this episode without crying gets a free sticker whenever those comes out. Yeah.
That's right.
But
Yeah.
anyway.
Got to work on the merch.
Yeah.
Okay. So the next part, as Kelsey, you said, we'll talk about this later, dealing with those who don't understand. And the
Mhm.
reality is that a lot of people, when you're grieving, unless they've been through it themselves, or unless they're a very special person, they will not understand. That's a reality. And it may not have any connection to how much they care about you or what a good person they are, but it's just something like traveling, or like having a kid, or like so many things in life. You just can't really understand it unless you go through it. You can understand it conceptually, but you don't know what it's like. And I would say that's even true for specific types of loss. If you have lost a parent, you don't know what it's like to lose a spouse or a child or any of those things. And even to make it more complicated, even the people who have the same kind of loss have lots of differences, because every loss is unique, because every person is unique, every relationship is unique. So no, if anybody says to you, I know what I know how you feel, or I understand, they right, yeah, that they don't know what they're talking about. That's kind of a sign that it's like they may not be a safe person to really open up to about your grief, unfortunately, because they can't. They might talk about a similar type of loss, and that can be helpful, but they do not fully understand you. And yet, if you can connect with others who have lost loved ones, say in a support group or in your personal life, then that can be really healing, because a lot of the feelings are the same, a lot of the experiences and the things that are helpful are the same, even though there are differences too.
Yeah. I think a kind of an interesting point on this, and yeah. Um, when I think about the times that I've been grieving or going through it, I think some of the people that have been in some ways the most hurtful to me, or the most, like you said, unsafe people,
Mm-hmm.
were people who hadn't dealt with their own grief. And
Yeah,
so,
that's huge.
to me, this is maybe the first time I'll kind of say this, but that is, I definitely know this is something I want to talk about more too in upcoming podcast episodes. But, not only is it important for you to go through your own grieving process. And like you said, like you're just or not prolonging it. What was the word that you used? Postponing it.
Mm-hmm.
Not only are you like postponing your own dealing with your own grief, but sometimes within your refusal to deal with your own feelings, or you dealing with your own grief, like you can kind of hurt other people. And that works that way
Yes.
a lot in a lot of mental health context of when
Yeah.
you don't deal with your own stuff, it ends up hurting other people. But yeah, all this to
Yeah.
say, like, yep, you got to know who your safe people are in these situations, but at the same time,
Yeah.
grieving is important because then you can be a safe person for somebody else too. But yeah.
Yeah, that's a good way to say it. Yeah, you're paying it forward. You're training for when you get to be that person, and that is one of the few things that people eventually find that they appreciate after a loss. And they never have to be happy or okay with their loss, but
Yeah.
but it does have some things that it teaches us, and one of them is empathy and compassion for others who have been through something similar.
Yeah.
So, but yeah, we all have that family member, or we all have come across that person who, as they age, they just can't stop treating the adults like children, or they just can't. And those are the people who are going to have the hardest time with grief and with their own aging. It's like just that resistance to change, and I get it.
Hmm.
I get that tendency to want to. I mentioned earlier that the nostalgia is one of my biggest vices, probably, and maybe I mentioned it in a therapy session recently, but yeah, I get that tendency to want to kind of freeze time or to go back in time, but we need to also accept the good and the bad, and the gifts and the struggles of the present, and thinking about the realities of the future too. So, well, just on the topic of dealing with people who don't understand, you were saying that it is important to identify who are the safe people and who are not. And yeah, like I was saying, unfortunately, the people who you're closest to may not be the ones who are the safest to grieve around. And sometimes people come from out of nowhere and show you all kinds of helpful support. So your relationships can change too sometimes, and that's another secondary loss that we go through. But it's important to try to be patient with people and to realize that they don't understand and that they're usually doing their best. I actually, and here's a resource that we can link to in our podcast notes. I put together a list of 20 things that your grieving friends and family wish you knew. So, and I have some videos with it too, where I go more in depth with them. But yeah, we can link to that document, because even if you're not grieving, there's a very good chance you know somebody who is. So you can learn
Hmm.
about how to be good support to them, or you can prepare for when you need to be,
Hmm.
or perhaps how to communicate to your loved ones how to help you. So, but it's good to identify those people and to feel free to tell people you need some space sometimes. It's also, like I mentioned about that balance, it's good to push yourself a little bit and to go out and do stuff, or to experiment with making some changes, but don't feel like you need to do that all the time, and to say, hey, I need some space, I need some time to myself as well. I need to slow down.
Yeah.
Okay, well, a few more things I wanted to talk about today. The next is about disenfranchised grief, and what that means is grief that society has even less room for than your kinds of typical or expected losses. So you think about the loss of a more distant family member, or the loss of a pet, like I mentioned earlier. A lot of people have no space for that in their head. It's like, it's just an animal, especially those like myself who aren't really pet owners,
Your
have a
wife too.
tendency to think that way. Yeah, my wife too, no doubt, right?
We've had
Yeah,
that conversation where I've lost a pet before, and she's like, "I'm just going to pretend it's a person because that helps me."
yeah,
Yep.
exactly. And honestly, that's what I have to do too. I have to be
Yeah.
like, I have to remind myself, okay, this is literally a family member to this person.
Yeah.
So, or, but yeah, many people don't understand that. There's other types of losses that are more uncomfortable to talk about, whether it's suicide or overdose or homicide. Loss of a sibling sometimes can be disenfranchised, because we tend to think about a partner or spouse, or sometimes a son or daughter, but not the siblings, or sometimes even the parents who lose an adult child. We don't really, they're like, okay, it's not a type of loss that we think about very often. And so we sometimes don't know how to respond to it. So it can help to think about, if you have any loved ones now or in the future who lose somebody, or of course, just a friend, uh, or sometimes if it's someone who's like a boyfriend or a girlfriend as opposed to a spouse or a life partner, all kinds of things, a step family member or something, to not necessarily assume that they're doing fine. There's a very good chance that they're not. One more thing that I don't have in the notes, but that goes along with this, and I hinted at it earlier, is about attachment, and how some people say, and about your quote from WandaVision, Kelsey, and it is a beautiful quote and better than most quotes out there about grief. But I do have one nitpick, and that is that grief is not the flip side of love. But it really is about attachment. And that's important because sometimes people can love someone very much, but maybe they've grown distant over the years, or maybe they've become very independent from that relationship. And so they find that they're not grieving very intensely and they feel bad and they question, did I really care about this person? Well, there's not a direct correlation there. And in other situations, I mentioned the toxic relationship. Somebody can be in an abusive relationship and something horrible can happen to their loved one, or not their loved one, but to their abuser who dies. And the person can have a really difficult time. And even if they would not say that they really loved them or had very much love for them, they were very attached to them because that was their relationship, that was their reality, that was a person probably controlling many aspects of their life. And so they have a big loss of structure, even though, again, there's also the loss of a lot of suffering. So it can help to think about that. And again, not even just with people, but with situations.
Yeah.
How attached are you to this situation? So maybe the Buddhists have something right about how, just detachment is the key to the relief of suffering. I think there's something to that, even though, that may not be like my entire personal philosophy. It can help to remember that association.
Yeah. Yeah. And even just attachment to situations. Like as a basketball coach, at the end of every season, when I know like a senior's career has just ended and my coaching of them has at very best, changed. Like I grieve every March. I go through a grief process, even if it's, I don't know if that's strong enough to be disenfranchised or, but just the attachment to situations too can be.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. And you might say it's disenfranchised because it's not one that someone's going to come up and ask, so Kelsey, I know it's March, how are you doing? Right.
Right.
But that doesn't make your grief any less legitimate. So.
Right.
I mentioned this next one already, that the only way out is through, so we can go right through that one. But the next one is about slowing down and taking your time. And like I said earlier about not staying busy, I guess I just want to spend a little bit more time with that, ironically, that it is important to do what I'm doing right now and make space for silence, for being on your own, or being with only one or perhaps two people who you trust and who understand you to some degree, who will let you grieve without just trying to fix you up and give you, a Band-Aid of oxy tissues.
Yeah.
We need to make space in our life for grief. And that's what I encourage people who, especially the ones I talk to whose loved ones died recently, and they have all these tasks that they need to take care of, all kinds of paperwork and phone calls and banks and insurance and all this stuff. I encourage them, or perhaps they have some other crisis pop up that they now have to deal with that will probably postpone their grief for however many months until they're done with that. That's just the reality of life sometimes. Perhaps it's finances or their own health issue. I don't know. But I encourage them, okay, take 30 minutes if you can. If not, 10 or 15 minutes is fine too. Set aside a regular time if you can, every morning or every evening or both, and just sit on your own. And again, feel your feelings, or look at pictures of your loved one who died, or listen to a song that reminds you of them, or go to a special place where you used to go together. These kinds of things that might be the last thing you want to do because they're going to trigger your grief, but it also gives you the opportunity to grieve so that you can kind of unload a little bit here and there as you go about your life. And if you can make even more time for that, then that's usually a good thing too.
Yeah. I feel like I've heard from people before that, the week of somebody passing away, that's not always the best time to check in, but a lot of times it's that week after or the 2 weeks after, once all the planning and all of the logistics of a funeral or some of those things that come along with somebody passing away. Once you run out of tasks to do, that's when the grief hits, and that's when it can be helpful to check in with somebody to see.
Absolutely.
Now that you've run out of things to do and run out of that busyness, like, how are you doing now?
Yeah,
But
right. It's all starting to catch up to them, perhaps.
yeah,
Right. Yeah. When in my hospice job, unless there's like a suicidality or homicidality situation, I always wait until at least the first week, even with the most difficult to complex situations, because whenever others in my team have urged me, no, no, they need a call as soon as possible. It's always, yeah, we don't really have time to talk right now. So I've learned my lesson enough times to say, no matter what anybody says, unless there's a very urgent danger, I'm going to wait at least a week.
yeah,
Yep.
yeah,
So, and I guess one more point on that slowing down is, again, this speaks to our lives in general, mental health in general, that of course society is no secret. We're getting more and more fast paced, and it seems like exponentially the snowball builds every year. So we're used to our instant streaming, our instant delivery, our instant self checkout aisle, everything, all these things that are right away. But grief is one of those constants that it's like no matter how fast paced society gets, it's going to take the time that it's going to take. And so that maybe helps me, I guess. I get to learn so much from people who are grieving without having to go through it myself. So, like I said, it really is a gift. But I learned from them the importance of going slowly with things, letting it take the time that it needs.
yeah,
Okay, just a couple more here. It is important to have balance in life. So don't keep busy all the time and don't slow down and isolate the entire time. Really, the last point that I wanted to make, it's something that I've been running into a lot with grieving clients recently, and that is that even though it's so important to take your time with grief, I remember, again, another Alan Wolfelt quote that there's no prize for speed, and um, there's no just getting it over with. That also, as time goes on, and as you work through your natural denial and shock, and you're expressing your feelings, you're feeling that pain, you're getting support, you're doing these, you're incorporating these rituals in your life that help you feel close to that person who died. You're doing all this hard, important grief work. That as you do these things to invite and open up new in your life. And so as time goes on, I'm talking about new experiences, new relationship and community, making some changes, painting the wall a different color or rearranging the furniture. But it's important to give it time. You don't want to rush right into that. Because if you do, that's just another way of avoiding your grief and making it harder to do the work that you need to do. So there is some kind of sequentialness that goes along with this, although it's not really like step by step by step. But there are things that tend to be appropriate earlier on, like shock and denial. And there are things that tend to be appropriate later on, like opening up to new things. And sometimes people can feel guilty about this. They can feel guilty about healing or about enjoying their life. It's like, how can I have fun going out to get ice cream when that's something that I used to always do with my wife or, whatever. But it can help to think about the fact that your loved one almost certainly wants you to get to that place. Maybe they would say, I sometimes hear like, oh, they'd be so upset to see me hurting so much and crying so much. And they always told me not to cry. It's like, well, they probably didn't understand what you have to go through because you love them so much.
yeah,
And so you can't always do like following your loved one's wishes isn't always the best idea, but I do encourage it when it comes to healing and moving through your grief and enjoying your life to remember that ultimately that's probably what they would want for you. And if they can see you, they're probably cheering you on.
yeah. I have one final question that I'd like to ask before we get to our reflection question, but
Please.
the question that I have would be, when would you recommend to somebody to go see a grief counselor, and when would you recommend or say that, maybe that's not necessary?
That's a great question. Yeah, that's a great question. Of course, as always, the answer is it depends. But I would say that, well, like we said in an earlier episode, you could benefit probably from grief counseling all throughout the process, even if you're not struggling at all. You might be struggling with the fact that you're not struggling. You might be asking, am I doing this right or wrong? Or should I be expecting something different? So there's always something to work on. But I would say that The big difference is what kind of other support do you have around you? So if you have people in your life, at least one or two people who can really sit with you in your grief and let you experience it and not try to fix you up, but just give you time, that's honestly a pretty rare thing. But if you have that, and if you can express your feelings, I would say that probably you're going to make it through okay. You could still probably benefit from grief counseling, so I'm not saying stay away, but I'm saying that you're probably going to be okay. And for those who don't have that, for those who have difficulty expressing their feelings or even knowing what their feelings are, this is something that I've been learning about professionally recently, is that even though I have always had language and an image to associate with my feelings, a lot of people don't necessarily know what that is. They truly, a lot of adults don't know what sadness looks like, what fear looks like, what happiness looks like. And so if that's you, or really if you're just running into any challenge where you feel stuck, I would say it's a good idea to at least consider seeking out a therapist who has experience with grief. And I have found that grief is one of those issues where some therapists are very uncomfortable with it. Even though we have training in this area on some level or another, I would say some areas like grief, like couples therapy, like substance abuse, or any kind of addiction or suicide, although really I think all therapists should be equipped to deal with suicide, and probably the vast majority are, but some would be very uncomfortable with that, unfortunately. So there are certain areas where it's good to look for those who have experience with it or who list it as a specialization. And I would say the grief is one of those. So something to keep in mind too. Or again, a support group. When it comes to grief, especially, and some other issues like trauma, getting support from others who have gone through something similar. And the more similar, the better off you're going to be. So if you can find one specific for your type of loss, all the better. But any kind of grief support group is another thing to consider.
Great. Yeah. Thank you so much for sharing all of your wisdom and your expertise with us. I think this is a super valuable episode, and even for somebody who maybe they're not grieving something now, but just something to keep in the back of your mind. So, when you do experience a loss, it's something to kind of reference and come back to, or if somebody close to you experiences a loss, and then you can kind of listen and perhaps have a little bit better of a chance of being one of those safe people for them. So
wonderful. Yeah, very well said. And this is kind of a grief 101. There's so much more that you would get into in therapy, of course. And like I mentioned earlier, there are so many things that grief speaks to that's not even directly about grief and loss. So I just had the idea that, maybe if I were to write a book, I think that would be a pretty interesting book. It's like all the stuff that grief teaches us about life that has nothing to do with specifically grief and loss, all those kinds of lessons. But
yeah,
anyway, so it's if this episode has piqued your interest, then I encourage you to delve deeper.
Yeah.
All right. Well, that leads us to our reflection question. So here it is. And I didn't pose it as a question. I posed it as sort of an assignment, I guess, but same kind of deal. So if you agree with me, or if you're open to agreeing with me that all change involves loss and that all losses need to be grieved, take a moment to think back through major changes that you have been through and ask yourself what losses were involved in those changes and whether or not you have begun to grieve for them. So that's your homework. That's your question to consider.
Great. All right. Well, that wraps up this week's episode, but be sure to follow us on Instagram at embrace.mental.health, right?
I think so.
I'm pretty sure.
We are so bad at the social medias. We need Anna here for that.
Yeah, seriously. Us two old millennials. We're not even but...
How about this? Type Embrace Mental Health into the search bar and look for the pine trees.
Yeah, there you go. And then Facebook, it has changed. I've reflected this in the show notes, but I think every time that we've announced it until now, it's been different, but it's facebook.com/emh.nsc. Because I'm a millennial, and like the funny thing is, it's like millennials are not known as not being good with technology, and Wesley is good with technology, but the more I do this podcast, I'm like, jeepers, the fact that I said jeepers. Makes me old, but my goodness sakes, I because of my own issues with technology, we can't have the other Facebook.
This is why we can't have nice things.
Yeah, straight up. But
Yeah.
yes.
And then what about email?
Our email is embrace.mental.health.nsc@gmail.com. So
Yeah, and we're just today we were in conversation about how we really want to start incorporating questions into the podcast, and so we may start doing that as soon as the next episode, or probably the one after that at the latest. So please send us your questions and your thoughts, and let's make this a conversation. I know we've been talking about it, and so now that we're in episode 7, we're ready to actually implement that.
Yes. All right. Thank you for joining us, everybody, and again, thank you, Wesley, for all the beautiful things that you shared with us tonight. So.
Oh, thank you. It's a pleasure. Okay, bye.